Hello, my brother. Welcome to the Great Man Within podcast. Every episode designed to help you discover and live the great man within you. Henry David Thoreau once said, "It is easier to sail many thousands of miles through cold and storm and cannibals than it is to explore the private sea, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans of one's being alone." I think we are more prepared now to hear the true wisdom of Henry David Thoreau's words than we ever have been before after spending these last few weeks, these last few months in quarantine. Recognizing how busy we make our lives, how many distractions we need, how many places we want to go, how many people we want to see, because it's so difficult for us to sit with ourselves alone. And Henry David Thoreau wrote this book, Walden, this quote was pulled from the final few pages of the book. And I also used this quote as kind of the clincher at the very end of my TEDx talk. He had spent 2 years and 2 months in near complete isolation in Walden, Massachusetts, on his own accord, to see if he could simplify his life, to see what little he could make do with, to understand the deep recesses and the worlds of excitement and the worlds of discovery and exploration that lived inside of him, and how we can so overcomplicate our lives because of the discomfort that exists when we're with ourselves alone. I certainly know what that feels like. I've sat through 10 days of silent meditation. The first 48 hours of it were brutal, torture, especially when I didn't have any of my escape mechanisms or any distractions. And in this same book, Henry David Thoreau says, kind of like a gut punch, the mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. And I believe that the reason for this, in many cases, is because we unwittingly run around trying to ignore or suppress or drown out those feelings of discomfort of what it's like to be on our own. I know there's a famous quote. I don't know who it's attributed to, but I remember seeing it in Boardwalk Empire, which is one of my favorite shows. And Arnold Rothstein, who was one of the criminals in the book, and he apparently fixed like the 1918 World Series. Arnold Rothstein says, "All of man's troubles come from his inability to sit in a room with himself, to sit in a room alone with himself." But Thoreau encourages that we do exactly that. And when we do sit down in that room alone with ourselves, he has some particular advice. He says, "Direct your eye inward, and you'll find 1,000 regions in your mind yet undiscovered. Travel them and be expert in home cosmography." Now, cosmography is basically the mapping of features of heaven and earth. I don't want to act like I already knew what that was. I had to ask Alexa to define that for me. And I can personally attest to the wisdom of what Thoreau is sharing here, because there was a period of time in my life where I couldn't sit still, where I would take on any challenge or any obstacle that someone would throw my way. I wanted to read every single book that was out there. I wanted to travel around the world. There was a year where I put like 150,000 miles on my Delta Airlines, going from one place to another, because anytime I sat still, I felt like discomfort, dis-ease. I wanted to watch every single amazing TV show. I just wanted to know everything. I wanted to be on every newsletter. I wanted to sign up for every personal development workshop. I wanted to do every coaching experience. And while I grew and developed through all of those things, without question, and potentially from the outside world, it may have looked like I was living a pretty cool life, underlying all of that was a sense of discomfort. This inability to explore the private sea, right? The Atlantic and Pacific Ocean of being alone. But over these last 4 or 5 years, and in particular the last year and a half, I have very intentionally cultivated moments of solitude where I could learn to be by myself, learn to be on my own, and not just learn, but to love that, right? And this quarantine situation has actually really dialed that up for me, because 8 straight weeks of really not seeing anybody, not being in physical proximity with anyone, has really taken this to a whole new level. And I can say without question, if I hadn't prepared for this, over the previous years of training, this would have been a really difficult experience for me. And that's why I can empathize with so many of you who are in a similar situation of being isolated, being alone, but haven't necessarily had the practice. And that's why I don't typically like to encourage practice as a preventative measure for something bad that may happen. Quite the opposite. I mean, I started my solitude practice because I wanted to learn myself. I wanted to love myself. I wanted to understand why I did the things that I did. I wanted to understand why I would go after such big achievements and not really enjoy the process and only feel a blip of excitement once I achieved it and then moved on to the next thing. Like, why was I running on that hamster wheel all the time? It was only through solitude and through creating space between stimulus and response that I started to see my life much more clearly. And I offer all of this wisdom from Henry David Thoreau up to you in the event that you'll find wisdom for yourself. All right, we are about to get into a recap of all of the episodes from this past week. And I just wanted to give you a reminder that starting this Monday, May the 4th, we are now going to be moving from daily podcasts, which I've been doing for the last almost 2 months now, to 3 times a week podcasts on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So many of you have reached out to say that how much you have appreciated the daily podcasts, and I appreciate you. And the reason why we're dialing this back to 3 times a week is so that I can invest the extra time and energy in building community online, programs online, so that more of you can move from just the listening experience into the leveling up, to actually doing the inner work, not just on your own, but with other men around the world who are doing the same thing. So stay tuned for that. I've got a lot of amazing things in store for you. Okay, so let's get into the recap from this last week. On Monday, we released an episode called What Great Male Allies in the Workplace Do, featuring Roshana Bide. So imagine this. Imagine a hoity-toity consulting company coming into your workplace, interviewing all of the women in your business ecosystem. I'm talking about your colleagues, clients, bosses, direct reports, staff, and they're asked only one question. When you think of a male ally, who immediately comes to mind? Would these women name you as one of the men? A great man creates environments where you and those you care about can thrive. This is what great male allies do. And the interview that we did on Monday with Roshana Bide, who's an organizational psychologist and 20-year veteran of male-dominated businesses, she taught us a number of lessons on how to become a top-notch male ally of women in the workplace. On Tuesday, we released an episode, a solo episode called, when I say solo episode, it was just me, myself, just like this, called Great Male Leaders Build Cultures of Inclusion. And in that episode, I tell you about one of my biggest failures as a leader when I was moved from an individual contributor role into my very first management role at Prudential Retirement, a Fortune 100 company, where I was responsible for running a sales group, a small sales team that had a big territory, the eastern half of the country, 7 men. And how I built a culture that was really strong and powerful for those 7 men, but I failed to build the culture of tomorrow, where when one of those men left to go to a competitor and we filled the spot with the most qualified candidate, which was a woman, I hadn't prepared the culture to be ready for evolving to a diverse group of both men and women in that sales team. And I share with you some of the downstream effects of how that turned out and how I, as a conscious male leader, will never let that happen again, and how I challenge you and charge you to build the culture, not just for today, but also for tomorrow, because a great man creates environments where we and everyone we care about can thrive. On Wednesday, I released an episode called 5 Things Successful Women Taught Me About Grit. Now, Angela Duckworth wrote the book on grit, and she defines grit as passion and sustained persistence applied toward a long-term achievement with no particular concern for rewards or recognition along the way. Now, I had the honor of interviewing 14 highly successful women, most of whom had built careers in male-dominated businesses, and I created a separate podcast series called Design Your Future, and you can go get that at doinnerwork.com/resources. There are 14 episodes of high-performing women that I had a chance to shine a light on and interview and unpack their stories about overcoming, feelings of not good enough, of how they beat burnout, how they design the years of themselves. And quick hit, the 5 things that they taught me about grit was number 1, resiliency is invaluable when playing the long game. Number 2, know when to put down the armor. Not every context of life is a battlefield, fellas. The things that make you awesome at the boardroom can also make you shitty as a husband, dad, or a dating partner, right? Number 3, grit and only grit in your life can be reckless. Without a conscious recovery strategy or a work-life harmony strategy, burnout is right around the corner if you're just grit all the time. Number 4, we are stronger together than we are alone. What women's groups have taught me, the proliferation and growing success of women's business groups have made a lot of progress in areas where there had been long ignored inequalities. And while there's still much more work to be done, these groups have proven that women are stronger together than they are on their own. And it's the same thing for us, fellas, right? Like, that's why it's not just about being a great man on your own. Personal development on your own is slow, shallow, and incomplete. We are stronger as a band of brothers. And the 5th thing that these high-performing women taught me about grit is that we, gentlemen, can do a better job rewarding and recognizing the women in our lives when they show up big time. Remember, Angela Duckworth's definition of grit includes this qualifier, which is with no particular concern for rewards or recognition along the way. And a lot of these women have succeeded. These 14 women who have built 20, 30, 40-year careers in male-dominated businesses have succeeded at the highest of levels. And many times they have no idea how powerful they are, how inspiring they are, because they haven't received that kind of recognition or reward. They've actually come to block a lot of that because they see it as being either too self-indulgent or maybe they're not supposed to. But we as men, as male leaders, especially for those of us who are working in male-dominated businesses, I believe have a duty to call out and recognize great job performance and to shine a light on these on powerful performance, especially for the women in our lives. On Thursday, I did a solo episode called Purpose Requires Simplifying Your Life. Now, I pulled a quote from Gary Keller's #1 New York Times bestselling book called The One Thing, and it said, "We are kept from our goal, not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal." Now, back in 1997, when Steve Jobs came back to a struggling Apple, right? Like, this was the company that he formed, but then he was ousted as CEO. When he came back in 1997, Apple's product suite had 350 products in it. Within a period of 2 years, he jettisoned 340 of them and whittled down Apple's product suite to 10 in a period of 2 years. Now, I'm sure that all 350 of those products had a reason for existence and likely even some pretty talented people attached to them working in that organization. But those 350 products confused the market, scattered resources, and diffused their collective potential as Apple as a company. But we all know how that process of simplification turned out, right? When it comes to finding purpose in your life, a similar simplification process must take place because your life often gets more complicated than it needs to be. And I'm only speaking as a notorious and rapidly rehabilitating right now overcomplicator. So if you truly want to live an extraordinary life of purpose, the trivial many must give way to the vital few. On Friday, the episode was entitled, 1 Year from Today, Will You Be Proud? And I invited you to take a pause from whatever it was you were doing to join me in a 60-second exercise. And this exercise may be the very difference between looking back at yourself a year from now and feeling immense pride about how you've shown up during these tumultuous times, or being disappointed with yourself. And I asked you these 3 questions. I wanted you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 for each of these following 3 questions. Number 1, I'm proud about how I've shown up as a leader in my work over these last 2 months. Scale of 1 to 10. I'm proud of how I've shown up as a leader in my work over these last 2 months. 1 being not true at all, 10 being extremely true. How would you rate yourself? Number 2, I'm proud about how I've shown up as a leader in my family or relationships over these last 2 months. 1 being not true at all, or a 10 being completely true, or whatever number in between. I'm proud about how I've shown up as a leader in my family and relationships over these last 2 months. And the third and final question is, I'm proud about how I've led myself over these last 2 months, right? Led myself with how well I took care of my personal, physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Did I sleep the right way? Did I exercise enough? Did I fuel my body appropriately? Did I take enough recovery time? On a scale of 1 to 10, how true is this statement of, I'm proud about how I've led myself over these last 2 months? Now, I want you to take a look at your lowest score. What was the area where you gave yourself the lowest score? This one requires the most immediate attention, and this is going to be your area of focus for the next 7, 10, or 30 days to get yourself back on track, because this will be the difference between you looking back at yourself a year from now and saying, I did that well, or being disappointed in yourself for saying, I was drifting. And then finally on Saturday, I released an episode called Why You Need a Wise Male Mentor. And I pulled a quote from Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, that says, mature men need to admire other men, both living and dead. We especially need to have contact with older men who we can look up to. And I shared a story with you about an email I'd gotten from a friend of mine that I went to high school with, who we played on the same football team together. And he said to me, Dominic, at some point after the age of 40, I accepted that mentors and leaders may not be in the cards for me after my only older male mentor died earlier this year. And that saddened me, because the idea of a man going through some of the most challenging and transformative years of his life without the guidance or counsel of someone who had been there before is upsetting and also unacceptable to me. And why is it that most men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s have no wise elder male mentor to look up to? Where have all the wise male mentors gone? And in that episode, I share with you one of the most impactful men in my life. He was a wise elder male mentor when I was at my formative stages in college. From the years of 18 to 22, Dean Richard Mateer, for those 4 years, was my guide, my wise elder, and his impact on my life still exists today. It shows up in the way that I run this podcast, in the way that I coach my clients, in the way that I show up as a man. And this is a calling for why each of us, no matter what life stage we are at, need a wise male mentor. And I share with you 3 questions that I'm asking myself so that I can prepare myself to attract and seek out the next male mentor, wise elder in my life, and also what I can be doing to show up as a man who someone else of a higher caliber would want to mentor themselves, right? Like, I want to show up as a guy that someone could look at and be like, yeah, I want to invest in him. So those are all of the episodes from this past week. I would encourage you to go back and listen to any that you have missed or any that may stand out and say like, yeah, I need another hit of that. And just one final reminder that we are moving to a 3 times a week podcast from Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It has been my distinct honor and pleasure to show up for you every single day for the last 8 weeks and doing this podcast daily. I have learned a lot, and thank you for encouraging me along the way, sharing your reflections, letting me know what has worked for you, what you want to hear more of. I have a distinct belief in knowing that what we did together, me as the one who's speaking, you as the listeners, and those who are making changes in your lives, what we did together during this period of time will forever change the trajectory of all of our lives from this point forward. And I have the deepest gratitude for you for allowing me to be a part of that journey with you.